Europe is home to many unique cultures and people groups, spreading from the far reaches of northern Scandinavia all the way down to the shores of southern Greece, though I believe none of these peoples are as unique as the Finns. Hosting origins far different from any other European country, as well as speaking a language not closely related to any other European language, save maybe Estonian, the Finns are a fascinating example of the diversity that exists within Europe. But where exactly did the Finns come from, and what has happened to them throughout their long and storied history? Well, those are the questions I want to be answering in today's video, so without further ado, let's get straight into it. Similar to other Nordic countries, permanent human habitation in Finland is believed to have begun following the end of the last ice age in around 9000 BC, with the earliest of these settlers most likely being seasonal hunter-gatherers before eventually settling down and forming year-round settlements. A bit further down the line, the Neolithic period is believed to have begun in Finland by about 5300 BC, when Finland fell under the northeastern European comb ceramic culture, though it is still believed that the people of this era were largely dependent on hunting and fishing. It was also during this period that extensive trade networks began forming in Finland, with goods from many of the surrounding regions, including Scandinavia and the Baltic region, being dated to this time. From about 3200 BC onwards, it appears that either immigrants or a strong cultural influence from the south of the Gulf of Finland settled in the southwestern parts of the country. This culture was a part of the European battle axe cultures, which likely came from southern Sweden and are associated with the movement of the Indo-European speakers. This new battle axe and the pre-existing comb ceramic culture eventually merged into one, becoming the Keukainen culture. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Finnish is very difficult. That existed between 2300 BC and 1500 BC. Following this period, the Bronze Age began with the coastal regions of Finland becoming a part of the Nordic bronze culture, whereas the inland regions were primarily influenced by the bronze-using cultures of northern and eastern Russia. Now, some of you may be thinking, especially if you watch my Denmark video, that all this does not sound that unique or different to the other Nordic countries so far. However, the main thing that sets the Finns apart is not necessarily their ethnic background, which it must be said is still notably different to the other Scandinavians though, but rather their language. As I stated at the beginning of the video, the Finns actually speak a language completely unrelated to any other European language except Estonian and distantly Hungarian. This is due to the fact that Finnish is not even an Indo-European language, which comprises the entirety of the rest of European languages. Rather, Finnish is an Uralic language of the Finno-Ugric branch, which are believed to have descended from a single language spoken around the Ural Mountains in Russia sometime between 8000 and 2000 BC, with its closest modern relatives being the aforementioned Estonian, as well as a few small languages from the area such as Karelian. How exactly this language got to Finland is somewhat controversial these days, and numerous theories have been proposed. It was for a long time believed that the Finno-Ugric languages were first spoken in Finland during the comb ceramic period around 4000 BC. However, this has been disputed by some, with other historians arguing that the languages actually came to Finland in the late Bronze Age, which would imply that these languages replaced the pre-existing Indo-European language, potentially brought in by the aforementioned Nordic Bronze Age. It is posited that the Proto-Finnic language began around the southern coast of the Gulf of Finland before eventually spreading throughout the rest of the country and replacing any pre-existing languages. Regardless of how and when the language got to Finland, its speakers eventually developed into the Iron Age around 500 BC, and following the rise of the Roman Empire, similarly to Denmark, Finland is believed to have become extremely prosperous off the back of Roman trade into the region. With that being said though, there are very few records, or evidence even, of what was going on in Finland during this time, with the first official mentions of the name Suomi, which means Finland in Finnish, dating to the time of the Frankish Empire, being written between 741 and 829. Despite the fact that not many official records mention the Finns from this period, it is known that they were at least known to their Swedish neighbours, with considerable contact occurring between the two peoples even during pre-Christian times. The Vikings were known to the Finns, likely due to their raiding nature, as well as their trade, with there actually being possible evidence of a Viking settlement in the Finnish mainland. Additionally, the Åland Islands also most likely had Swedish settlement during the Viking period, though some scholars claim it was deserted during the 11th century. Also during the 11th century, based on archaeological finds, it is believed that Christianity first gained a foothold in Finland, though some medieval legends from the late 13th century describe Swedish attempts to conquer and Christianize Finland sometime in the mid-1150s. Sadly for the Finns, this period would also mark the beginning of their what would come to be centuries of struggle for independence, with several powers attempting to subjugate the Finnish tribes around this time, including the Danes, the Russians of the Republic of Novgorod, likely German crusading orders, and of course their old friend Sweden, who would eventually be successful in subjugating the non-unified Finns, who at the time were split into three cultural or tribal areas, being the Finns, Tavastians, and Karelians during the Second Swedish Crusade in 1249. A potential reason for the confusion around the Finns' faith of the time is that a papal letter from 1237 actually states that at least the Tavastians had reverted from Christianity back to their old ethnic faith. The Republic of Novgorod would also eventually be successful to a degree, as they gained control of Karelia in 1278, with the remainder of Finland being firmly under Swedish control by 1293. Following the Swedes' conquest, and maybe even slightly before it, a large number of Swedish settlers moved to the southern and northwestern coast of Finland, as well as the aforementioned Åland, with Swedish still being widely spoken in these areas even in the modern day. During this period, Swedish is also believed to have become the language of the upper class in many other parts of Finland as well. Another significant event occurred in 1362 when representatives from Finland, which by this point was well and truly a part of the Christian faith, were called to participate in the elections for the King of Sweden, with this year consequently often being considered the year that Finland was officially incorporated into the Kingdom of Sweden. This time period also saw many armed conflicts take place between Sweden and Novgorod over the eastern parts of Finland, which the Novgorodians considered the hunting and fishing grounds of its Karelian subjects. Occasional raids and clashes in this region persisted into the late 14th and 15th centuries, but for the most part an uneasy peace prevailed. Elsewhere in Northern Europe, a civil war broke out in Sweden proper in the 1380s, which naturally brought unrest to Finland as well. The victor of this struggle was Queen Margaret I of Denmark, who united all three of the Scandinavian kingdoms under her rule as the Kalmar Union. If you watched my Denmark video, you would know that Sweden soon became discontented with its place in the Kalmar Union, and over the next 130 or so years fought for its succession from the Union, with Finland sometimes being involved in these efforts, though it must be said for the most part, Finland seems to have prospered under the Kalmar Union in the 15th century. This, unfortunately, would not last long, as in the last few years of the 15th century, tensions escalated on the eastern border after the Grand Principality of Moscow conquered Novgorod, paving the way for a unified Russia. These tensions eventually erupted into the Russo-Swedish War of 1495-97, though this war was relatively minor and didn't see any major territorial changes, with a 6-year truce being agreed upon in March 1497. In the following century, in 1521, the Kalmar Union finally collapsed, and Gustav Vasa became the King of Sweden and by extension Finland, and would actually go on to found Helsinki in 1550, though the settlement remained nothing more than a fishing village for more than 2 centuries. Gustav I's successor, his son Erik, would go on to plunge Sweden into war in 1561, following his father's death the preceding year, when the Swedish crown took control of the city of Tallinn in Estonia, an action which contributed to the early stages of the Livonian War, which was a warlike era in the Baltics which would go on to last over 150 years on and off. During this time, the common people of Finland suffered extensively due to drafts, high taxes, and abuse by soldiers. This resulted in the Cudgel War, a peasant revolt in Finland in 1596-97, which was predictably brutally crushed by the upper classes, with the leader of the rebellion, Jaakko Ilkka, as well as other peasant leaders being executed on the 27th of January 1597. On more peaceful matters, the rough borders of modern Finland were established following the Treaty of Tuusina with Russia in 1595. Also during the 16th century, a significant shift in Finland occurred, as the crown encouraged farmers to settle the vast wilderness regions in middle Finland, which often forced the original Sami population to leave, and during the 1580s resulted in a bloody guerrilla war between the Finnish settlers and Karelians in some regions. In the following 17th century, from 1611 to 1632, Sweden was ruled by King Gustavus Adolphus, whose military reforms transformed the Swedish army from a peasant militia into an efficient fighting machine, possibly the best in Europe. This new elite military would not go unused, as in 1630, following the completion of the conquest of Livonia, the Swedish and Finnish armies marched into Central Europe as part of the Protestant Catholic War known as the 30 Years' War, which resulted in the Swedish Empire becoming one of the most powerful countries in Europe following the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. During the war, several important reforms occurred in Finland, with the first Finnish university being founded in Turku in 1640 at the proposal of the General Governor of Finland, Count Pöbra, as well as the whole Bible being published in Finnish in 1642. Despite this, the high taxation, never-ending wars, and cold climate worsened due to the Little Ice Age made the imperial era of Sweden not an ideal time to be a Finnish peasant. This aforementioned Little Ice Age went on to cause a famine in Finland in 1696-99, which, due to a combination of an early frost, freezing temperatures preventing grain from reaching Finnish ports, and a questionable lack of response from the Swedish government saw about 1/3 of the Finnish population die. Shortly following the end of this famine, yet another war would take place on Finnish soil, the Great Northern War, in which Finland became a battleground as opposing Swedish and Russian armies ravaged the countryside, which led to yet more famines, epidemics, and social disruption in Finland, which resulted in the loss of nearly half the population, with only 250,000 people remaining in the country by the end of the war in 1721, which is an extremely alarming number considering all the way back in the 1550s, nearly 200 years prior, Finland's population was about 300,000. Sweden's loss in the Great Northern War saw Russia annex the southeastern part of Finland, including the town of Vyborg, leaving the border with Russia roughly where it would be following World War II. On more positive notes though, throughout the remainder of the 18th century, which saw a time of relative peace in Finland, the population grew rapidly, doubling before 1800. The relative peace in Finland, at least compared to the preceding centuries, will not last forever though, as following the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, the Finnish War broke out between Sweden and Russia, in which Finland was conquered by the armies of Tsar Alexander I, and following Sweden's defeat and signing of the Treaty of Fredriksholm on the 17th of September 1809, Finland became a Grand Duchy under the Russian Empire. During the early years of this Russian domination, Finnish nationalism began to flourish, largely as a result of the deliberate actions of the Swedish-speaking upper classes to promote Finnish culture and language as a means of nation building. In 1863, another significant shift occurred when the Finnish language gained an official position in administration, and in 1892 it became an official language, and finally gained a status comparable to that of Swedish, though Swedish continued to be the language of culture, arts, and business all the way to the 1920s. Likely in response to this growing nationalism in Finland, the Russians adopted a policy of Russification in Finland, with the aims of fully integrating the Grand Duchy of Finland politically, militarily, and culturally into the empire. This was predictably strongly resisted by the Finns, who fought back by passive resistance and a strengthening of Finnish cultural identity. Finland would finally gain its independence in the aftermath of the October Revolution in 1917, though this newly found independence would come at a cost, as Finland by this time was bitterly divided along social lines. The so-called whites consisted of the Swedish-speaking middle and upper classes, as well as the farmers and peasantry from the northern 2/3 of the land, and had a conservative political view. On the other hand, the Reds comprised the Finnish-speaking urban workers and the landless rural cottagers, and as befits communists, had a radical outlook and completely rejected capitalism. These differences, not too surprisingly I must say, eventually boiled over into a brief but bloody civil war in Finland, which lasted from January to May 1918. The Reds initially had a strong start to the war, but due to a lack of strong military leaders, they were unable to capitalize, with the Whites led by the soon-to-become legendary Karl Mannerheim going on to defeat the Reds in the first and bloodiest major battle of the war in Tampere in late March and early April 1918, where a force of 16,000 White troops engaged 14,000 Red defenders. After a bit over a week of brutal urban combat, the Whites eventually went on to repel the Reds from the city, at the cost of 700 to 900 Whites killed and 1,000 to 1,500 Reds. It was also in March that what would prove to be the fatal blow to the already struggling Red cause would come when the German Empire intervened on the side of the White Army and quickly captured Helsinki. The last real stand of the Reds would come in late April at the Battle of Viipuri, where the Whites, following the German army's capture of Helsinki, advanced towards the city. Following some skirmishes surrounding the city, the Whites launched their final attack on the 27th of April with a heavy artillery barrage. The Reds' defense gradually collapsed and the Whites emerged victorious just 2 days later in the early hours of the 29th of April, effectively crushing any notable Red resistance. And following a few small-scale engagements in early May, the war officially ended on the 15th of May 1918. When it was all said and done, 37,000 people had been killed in the war, with most of these being Reds after the war in military camps, which were ravaged by influenza and other diseases. The war also saw many other acts of brutality, such as summary executions on both sides, which resulted in the alarming fact that of the 37,000 killed in the war, less than 9,000 were actually killed in battle. Following the Civil War, the parliament controlled by the Whites initially voted to become a constitutional monarchy, with German Prince Frederick Charles of Hesse as king, though following Germany's defeat and the abolition of its monarchy, this became impossible, and as such, Finland opted to become a republic instead, with Kallio-Juho Stalberg being elected as its first president in 1919. Finland remained a steady capitalist democracy in the following decades, despite the bitter civil war and repeated threats from fascist movements, many of which had gained traction as a side effect of the nationalistic sentiment sentiment prominent during the Civil War. Not all Finland's post-Civil War threats were from within, however, as following the Reds, who had been backed by the Soviets' defeat, relations with the Soviets predictably remained tense, and by 1937 it was all but certain to boil over into conflict. A conflict which I'm sure many of you know would come in the form of the Winter War, when on the 30th of November 1939 the Soviet Union invaded Finland with the aim of annexing Finland into the Soviet Union under the Finnish Democratic Republic, which was established by Stalin at the beginning of the war with the purpose of governing Finland after the Soviet conquest. What no one saw coming though was the incredible efforts of the Finns to resist the Soviet invasion. The Soviet hopes of an easy conquest were quickly dashed by the Finns, who relentlessly resisted the Soviets and made them pay bitterly for every inch of Finnish land they occupied. One of the most pivotal moments of the early war came at the Battle of Suomussalmi in December, where the heavily outnumbered Finns, numbering just 17,000 compared to 48,000 Soviets, with the help of their high mobility using skis and sleds, as well as their knowledge of the landscape, repelled Soviet attempts to cut Finland in half and take the city of Oulu in the northern part of the country, with the Soviets ultimately suffering between 22,500 and 27,000 casualties compared to just 2,700 Finnish. In the south, the Finns also held firm along the Mannerheim line, while elsewhere they engaged in guerrilla tactics with devastating efficiency in the heavily wooded and marshing landscape of Finland. Another factor which undoubtedly helped the Finnish was the extreme cold, with temperatures reaching as low as -40°C at some points, with thousands of Soviet troops who were unprepared for such bitter cold suffering frostbite as a result. After 2 months of this, whilst achieving negligible progress and severe losses, the Soviets put an end to the Finnish Democratic Republic in late January 1940 and indicated to the Finns that they would be willing to negotiate an end to the conflict. Unfortunately for the Finns, they would ultimately be essentially forced into peace talks following a renewed offensive by the Soviets in February 1940, which overcame the Finnish defences on the Karelian Isthmus, leaving the Finnish army near breaking point and a retreat seeming inevitable. At this, the Finnish commander-in-chief, Karl Mannerheim, if you remember him from the Civil War, urged a peace deal with the Soviets while the Finns still regained bargaining power, which the Soviets, not keen to push through the rest of Finland knowing the heavy losses they would incur, readily assented to. Hostilities officially ceased in March 1940 with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, in which Finland ceded 9% of its territory to the Soviet Union, though retaining its sovereignty as well as greatly enhancing its international reputation due to its almost legendary efforts. Despite the fact that the Finns had ultimately lost the initiative towards the end of the conflict, that should not take away from their remarkable achievements during the war. A statistic which quite honestly shocked me when I first read it and highlights the effectiveness of the Finnish forces during the war is that by the end of the war, roughly 150,000 Soviets had been killed in Finland, in comparison to a bit under 26,000 Finns at a ratio of nearly 6-to-1 if my maths is correct. Even though Finland eventually lost notable territories and had to relocate a significant amount of people, all things considered I'd say the result was pretty positive for the Finns given the alternative, and still one of the most impressive military achievements in history. It seems that the Finns were not too content with these loss of lands though, as following the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Finns eagerly joined in, sparking the Continuation War, in which the Finns and Germans pushed in to retake previously Finnish-owned territories, as well as many surrounding territories they deemed part of Greater Finland, such as Karelia. The Continuation War would prove to be extremely costly for the already wounded Finnish army, as though Finland never became occupied by the Soviets, as the tide of the war turned against the Nazis, some 96,000 Finns were killed, compared to just 26,000 if you recall in the Winter War. Hostilities between the Finns and Soviets eventually ceased in September 1944 with the signing of the Moscow Armistice, in which Finland restored its borders per the post-Winter War Peace Treaty, and additionally ceded Petsamo and leased the Pohjola Peninsula to the Soviets. Finland was also required to pay war reparations to the Soviets, accept partial responsibility for the war, and acknowledge it had been a German ally. Finland was also required to expel German troops from its territory, which led to the relatively minor Lapland War between the once allied nations. During the war and afterwards, Finland was not seen as an enemy nation by the Allies, as the only allied nation it had taken up arms against was the Soviet Union, and as such the Allies determined that the Finns had been engaged in a separate war with the Soviets rather than against the Allies as a whole. This view was aided by the fact that the Finnish government did not participate in the systemic killing of Jews and remained a democracy throughout both the Winter War and the Continuation War. In the view of the Finns though, despite the fact their country lost territory in both its wars with the Soviets, the memory of these wars was sharply etched into its national consciousness, with Finland today celebrating both these wars as a victory for the Finnish national spirit spirit, which survived against long odds and allowed Finland to maintain its independence. In the post-war years and during the Cold War, Finland, despite tensions between itself and the Soviets, retained its democratic constitution and free economy and proclaimed its neutrality in all superpower politics and sought to align itself with its fellow Nordic nations. Finland went on to join the UN in 1955, though true to its neutrality didn't end up joining NATO until recent times following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Additionally, during the post-war period, Finland managed to turn a once war-ravaged economy into an incredibly strong one, soon emerging as one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world, with a sophisticated market economy and high standard of living, resulting in Finland being considered the happiest country in the world in modern times. With that though, we are beginning to get very close to the present, and I don't think that's what you guys are interested in, and neither am I, to be honest. So I think that's where I'm going to end the video. Thank you all so much for watching the video if you're still here. If you are, please do let me know in the comments if you would like, as that would make me happy knowing some people are enjoying the entirety of these long videos. With that being said though, I hope you have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you all in the next one.